The moment my wife's family started laughing at my father, I realized some people can spend their entire lives chasing wealth and still never learn what real value looks like. The party was supposed to be a celebration. Lauren's parents had rented a private ballroom at a country club just outside Chicago for their 40th wedding anniversary. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of expensive appetizers. Luxury cars filled the parking lot outside. Everywhere I looked, people were dressed to impress. And then my father walked in. William Carter arrived 10 minutes after I did. He stepped through the entrance wearing the same dark gray sport coat I'd seen him wear for years. It wasn't torn. It wasn't dirty. It was simply old. The kind of jacket a man keeps because he likes it, not because he can't afford another one. He drove himself there in a pickup truck that was older than some of the guests attending the party. The second Tyler Bennett spotted him, I knew trouble was coming. Tyler was Lauren's younger brother. He had a talent for turning arrogance into a personality trait. He glanced at my father's jacket, smirked, and nudged one of his friends. A few seconds later, they were all staring. Then came the first laugh. Quiet at first, barely noticeable, but it spread. "Andrew," Tyler said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Your dad actually wore that to a country club?" Several people chuckled. I felt my stomach tighten. My father simply smiled. "Good to see you too, Tyler," he replied calmly. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Tyler looked disappointed that he hadn't gotten a reaction. So he pushed harder. "I just figured someone would have helped you update your wardrobe by now." More laughter followed. I glanced toward Lauren, expecting her to say something. Anything. She didn't. She stood beside her mother holding a glass of wine and avoided eye contact completely. That hurt more than Tyler's joke. My father had always treated her kindly. He remembered every birthday, every holiday, every anniversary. Yet there she stood, silent while her family mocked him. What nobody in that room understood was that my father wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't even surprised. He had spent decades watching people judge others based on appearances. If anything, he seemed amused by it. But I wasn't amused. I watched guest after guest make assumptions about a man they knew nothing about. They saw an older gentleman in a simple jacket. They saw an old pickup truck. They saw a quiet man standing alone near the refreshment table. And in their minds, they had already decided exactly who he was. That's the thing about people like the Bennetts. They believe money gives them the ability to measure everyone else's worth. The irony is that they're usually the worst judges of character in the room. A few minutes later, Lauren's father, Richard Bennett, climbed onto a small stage to give a speech. The room gradually became quiet. Glasses were raised. Conversations stopped. Richard thanked everyone for attending and shared stories about his marriage. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. Then his eyes landed on my father. A smile appeared on his face. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that appears right before someone says something they think is clever. And what happened next changed the entire night. Richard adjusted the microphone and smiled at the crowd, as if he were about to share some heartfelt family wisdom. For a moment, the room relaxed. People lifted their glasses. A few guests nodded along. Then Richard glanced toward my father, and I immediately recognized the look in his eyes. He had found a target. "Tonight is about celebrating success," he said. 40 years of hard work, smart decisions, and surrounding yourself with the right people. Several guests applauded. Richard paused dramatically before continuing. "Of course, not everyone in life makes the same choices." A few people laughed. My father remained seated, quietly sipping a glass of iced tea. Richard smiled wider. "Some people spend their lives building something meaningful. Others spend their lives watching." More laughter followed. It was subtle enough to give him plausible deniability, but obvious enough that everyone understood exactly who he was talking about. I felt my jaw tighten. My father still did not react. The strange thing was that his calmness almost seemed to encourage them. When people see someone refusing to defend themselves, they often mistake dignity for weakness. Richard stepped off the stage a few minutes later and returned to his table. The comments should have ended there. Instead, they multiplied. Guests began making assumptions out loud. One man asked my father whether retirement checks were enough to live on these days. Another asked if he still drove the same old truck because he was sentimental or because he could not afford a newer one. Each question was disguised as polite conversation. Each one carried the same message underneath. They believed they were speaking to a man who had fallen behind in life. My father answered every question with the same patience. No anger, no defensiveness, no attempt to impress anyone. Watching him sit there reminded me of something he used to tell me when I was younger. He always said that people reveal themselves much faster than they reveal the truth about you. At the time, I never fully understood what he meant. That night, I understood perfectly. Across the room, Lauren continued talking with her friends. She laughed at their jokes. She smiled for photographs. She acted as though nothing unusual was happening. Eventually, I walked over to her. "You are really not going to say anything?" I asked quietly. Lauren sighed. "Andrew, can you please not make this a bigger deal than it is?" I stared at her. "They are humiliating my father. They are just joking. Does he look like he is laughing?" She glanced toward him. "Your dad does not seem bothered." That answer irritated me more than I expected. Not because she was entirely wrong. My father genuinely did not appear bothered. But there is a difference between enduring disrespect and deserving it. The fact that he carried himself with grace did not make their behavior acceptable. Before I could respond, Tyler suddenly appeared beside us holding a drink. His face carried the confidence of someone who had never been forced to question his own importance. "Come on, Andrew," he said. "Everybody is having fun." Then he looked toward my father again. Honestly, I respect the guy. Showing up to a country club dressed like that takes confidence. His friends laughed. Lauren shook her head as if he were being harmlessly mischievous. I wanted to say something. I wanted to defend my father the way he had defended me my entire life. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the look on my father's face. Maybe it was the strange feeling growing in the back of my mind. Because despite everything that was happening, he seemed unusually relaxed. Almost as though he already knew how the night was going to end. And then something unexpected happened. The ballroom doors opened, and a man in an expensive navy suit stepped inside. He looked around the room only briefly before his eyes locked onto my father. The expression on his face changed instantly. Suddenly, he was no longer looking at an ordinary guest. He was looking at someone important. The man moved through the ballroom with purpose. He was probably in his late 50s, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that looked like it cost more than most people spent on a month's rent. Conversations continued around the room, but I noticed something interesting. Several guests recognized him immediately. A few straightened their posture. Others whispered to one another. Even Richard Bennett seemed curious. The man ignored everyone. He did not stop to shake hands. He did not greet the hosts. He did not acknowledge the guests who clearly wanted his attention. Instead, he walked directly toward my father. Tyler noticed it too. "Who is that?" he asked one of his friends. Nobody seemed to know. The man finally reached my father's table and smiled. It was not the polite smile people use at social events. It was genuine, respectful, familiar. "William," he said warmly, "I hope I am not too late." My father stood and shook his hand. "You are right on time, Charles. Right on time." The phrase stuck in my head. Charles pulled out a chair and sat beside him as though they had known each other for years. Maybe they had. What surprised me was the way he treated my father. There was no condescension, no polite pity, no sense that one man was more important than the other. If anything, Charles seemed eager to earn my father's approval. Across the room, curiosity spread quickly. Tyler stopped laughing. Lauren glanced over several times. Even Patricia Bennett appeared distracted from her conversations. People wanted answers. The problem was that nobody had any. A few minutes later, I excused myself and walked toward their table. As I approached, Charles was speaking quietly. I only caught part of the conversation, The board wants a decision before the end of the month, he said. They are nervous about delaying any longer. My father nodded thoughtfully. Let them be nervous for a little while. Charles laughed. Not the forced laugh people use around wealthy donors or important clients. A real laugh. The kind that comes from genuine respect. When they noticed me standing there, my father smiled. Andrew, good to see you. Charles immediately stood and extended his hand. You must be Andrew. I shook it. Nice to meet you. Your father speaks highly of you. That caught me off guard. My father rarely bragged about anything, especially not his family. Before I could respond, Tyler suddenly appeared beside us. His curiosity had finally overcome his ego. I do not think we have met, Tyler said, inserting himself into the conversation. Charles looked at him politely. Charles Whitmore. Tyler's expression changed slightly. He clearly expected the name to mean something. Apparently it did not. Are you in business together? Tyler asked. For a brief moment, Charles looked toward my father before answering. It was subtle, but I noticed it, almost as if he were checking whether he should say more. My father simply took another sip of iced tea. You could say that, Charles replied. Tyler smiled confidently. What kind of business? Charles seemed amused by the question. The kind that keeps me very busy. It was a perfect answer because it revealed absolutely nothing. Tyler forced a laugh and eventually walked away. But the damage had already been done. People were paying attention now. Questions were spreading throughout the ballroom. Who was Charles Whitmore? Why was he sitting with William Carter? And why did he seem to treat him like one of the most important people in the room? What nobody realized was that this was only the first crack in the story they had created about my father. The assumptions that had seemed so obvious an hour earlier were beginning to fall apart. And before the night was over, every single one of them would discover just how wrong they had been. After Tyler walked away, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed in a way that was difficult to explain. Nobody said it out loud, but people were watching my father now. Earlier in the evening, they had dismissed him without a second thought. Now they were trying to solve a puzzle. The problem was that every answer they came up with only created more questions. Charles remained at the table with my father for nearly 20 minutes. During that time, several guests approached him. Some wanted to introduce themselves. Others clearly hoped to join the conversation. Charles greeted everyone politely, but his attention always returned to my father. It was almost as if everyone else in the room had become background noise. I noticed Richard Bennett watching from across the ballroom. His confidence from earlier had faded slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me. Richard was a man who prided himself on knowing important people. Yet he had no idea who Charles was. Worse, he had no idea why Charles seemed so interested in the man he had spent the evening mocking. Eventually, Richard walked over to our table carrying a drink and wearing his practiced social smile. I wanted to properly introduce myself, he said to Charles. Richard Bennett. Charles shook his hand politely. Good to meet you. Richard waited for recognition. It never came. For the first time all evening, he looked slightly uncomfortable. So what line of work are you in? Richard asked. Charles smiled. A little bit of everything. My father quietly chuckled beside him. Richard glanced at him, then back at Charles. And how do you know William? There was another brief pause. Again, Charles looked toward my father before answering. We have worked together for a long time. The answer sounded simple, yet something about the way he said it made Richard even more curious. Before he could ask another question, Charles's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and sighed. Looks like they are getting impatient. My father nodded. That tends to happen. Richard looked completely lost. Who is getting impatient? Charles slipped the phone back into his pocket. People who do not like waiting for decisions. Then he changed the subject entirely. The conversation moved on, but Richard's expression never recovered. He had expected answers. Instead, he had received mysteries. Across the room, Lauren finally approached me. What is going on? She asked quietly. You tell me. I am serious. So am I. She glanced toward my father and Charles. Do you know who that man is? No. That was technically true. I knew his name. Beyond that, I knew very little. Lauren folded her arms. Everybody is talking about them. I looked around the ballroom. She was right. Guests were whispering. Some were searching their phones. Others were trying to discreetly overhear conversations. The same people who had ignored my father earlier now seemed fascinated by him. The irony was impossible to miss. A few hours earlier, they had judged his entire worth based on an old pickup truck and a worn jacket. Now a single, unexpected connection was forcing them to question everything. What nobody realized was that they were still seeing only a fraction of the picture. The assumptions were beginning to crack, but the truth remained hidden. And as I watched my father calmly sip his iced tea while the room quietly revolved around him, I had the strange feeling that he was allowing all of this to happen for a reason, almost as though he knew something none of us did. Then the ballroom doors opened again, and 3 more people entered. The moment Charles saw them, he stood up. The moment my father saw them, he smiled. And that was when I realized the night was about to change forever. The 3 people who entered the ballroom did not look like ordinary guests. They moved with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being taken seriously wherever they went. One was a woman in an elegant black business suit carrying a leather portfolio. Another was a gray-haired man whose face seemed vaguely familiar, though I could not immediately place him. The third was younger, maybe in his 40s, with the polished appearance of a senior executive. The moment they stepped inside, Charles Whitmore walked toward them. My father remained seated. That was the first thing that caught my attention. If these people were important enough to make Charles stand up immediately, why was my father completely relaxed? The answer, I would later learn, was simple. He was not waiting for them. They were waiting for him. The 3 newcomers approached our table. The woman smiled warmly. Good evening, William. My father stood and shook her hand. Good to see you again, Rebecca. Again. Not nice to meet you. Not an introduction. They already knew each other. The gray-haired man extended his hand next. I hope we are not interrupting your evening. My father laughed softly. Considering how the evening started, you are actually improving it. For the first time all night, I saw genuine amusement in his eyes. Rebecca glanced around the ballroom. It was obvious she had noticed the curious stares from nearby guests. It seems people are interested in your table tonight. My father smiled. People are always interested in mysteries. Meanwhile, the rest of the room was becoming impossible to ignore. Conversations were slowing down. More and more guests were watching. Tyler had completely abandoned any attempt to appear casual. He was standing across the room pretending to check his phone while clearly staring at our table. Richard Bennett was doing the same thing, though with considerably less subtlety. Even Lauren seemed increasingly unsettled. She walked over and stopped beside me. Who are they? She whispered. I have no idea. Your father never mentioned any of them? No. Lauren looked genuinely confused. For years, her family had assumed they understood exactly who my father was. Truthfully, I thought I did too. I knew him as the man who taught me to work hard. The man who never bragged. The man who drove the same truck for nearly 15 years because he said it still worked perfectly fine. I knew him as a good father, a dependable father. But as I watched these influential strangers gather around him, I realized there were entire parts of his life I had never questioned. Rebecca opened her portfolio and quietly handed my father several documents. He reviewed them without urgency. No dramatic reactions. No surprise. It looked like something he had done hundreds of times before. Charles leaned forward. The board would prefer an answer tonight. My father nodded. I expected as much. The younger executive laughed. They have been calling all day. My father signed one page and handed it back. Then they can stop calling. The 3 visitors exchanged relieved smiles. That single moment changed everything. Not because anyone overheard the details. Most people could not hear a word. What changed was their reaction. These successful, powerful individuals were not guiding my father. They were following him. And everyone in the ballroom could see it. The whispers grew louder. The assumptions grew weaker. The story people had invented about William Carter was collapsing piece by piece. Yet the biggest truth remained hidden. Nobody knew why these people respected him. Nobody knew why Charles Whitmore seemed to defer to him. And nobody knew that before the night ended, the answer would leave the entire room speechless. For the next several minutes, nobody paid attention to the anniversary celebration anymore. The center of attention had quietly shifted to a table near the back of the ballroom, where my father sat with 4 people who clearly considered his opinion more valuable than anyone else's. The strange part was that my father seemed completely unaware of the effect he was having on the room. Or perhaps he simply did not care. Rebecca closed her portfolio and thanked him again before taking her seat. Charles relaxed for the first time all evening. The younger executive checked his phone and smiled. The market is going to react well to this. My father shrugged. The market usually overreacts to everything. They all laughed. Not because it was particularly funny, but because it sounded like the kind of comment someone makes after decades of experience. Across the ballroom, curiosity was turning into obsession. I could see guests discreetly searching names on their phones. Some were trying to identify Charles Whitmore. Others were attempting to figure out who Rebecca was. Every answer seemed to create even more confusion. Meanwhile, Tyler Bennett was becoming visibly irritated. Earlier, he had been the loudest person in the room. Now he looked like a man watching control slip through his fingers. Eventually, he marched over to Richard and Patricia. The 3 of them began talking quietly. Their eyes kept drifting toward my father's table. Whatever they were discussing, it was not making them feel any better. Lauren stood beside them. She looked uncomfortable. Not embarrassed exactly. More unsettled. As though she had suddenly realized there was an entire chapter of my father's life she had never bothered to learn about. I could not stop thinking the same thing myself. Growing up, my father had never talked about status. He never bragged about accomplishments. He never collected expensive things simply to impress people. When I was a teenager, I once asked him why he still drove old vehicles when he could easily afford something newer. He smiled and said, "Because I buy things to use them, not to announce myself." At the time, I assumed it was just one of his life lessons. Standing in that ballroom, I found myself wondering whether there had been more truth behind those words than I realized. Suddenly, another guest approached our table. This time, I recognized him immediately. His face appeared regularly in business magazines and financial interviews. He was the chief executive officer of a major investment firm headquartered in New York. Before anyone could react, he walked directly up to my father and extended his hand. "William, it is good to see you again." My father stood and returned the handshake. "You too, Michael." The executive smiled. "I heard rumors you might be here tonight." I did not believe them. My father laughed. "I am not that difficult to find." The executive glanced around the room and lowered his voice slightly. "A lot of people would disagree with that, even without hearing every word." Nearby guests noticed what was happening. The whispers grew louder. Several faces turned pale. Others looked stunned. A pattern was beginning to emerge, and people were finally noticing it. Important people kept arriving. Important people kept seeking out my father. Important people kept treating him as an equal or perhaps something more. Yet nobody could explain why. Richard Bennett finally lost patience. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and started walking toward our table. Tyler followed immediately behind him. Lauren hesitated for a moment before joining them. The 3 of them looked determined to get answers. What they did not realize was that the answers they were about to receive would be far different from anything they expected. Richard Bennett stopped a few feet from the table and forced a smile that looked increasingly uncomfortable with every passing second. Tyler stood beside him with his arms crossed. Lauren remained slightly behind them, watching carefully. For the first time all evening, none of them seemed completely sure of themselves. Richard cleared his throat. "William, I feel like we have not had a chance to properly catch up tonight." My father smiled politely. "It has been a busy evening." Richard laughed. Apparently, nobody at the table missed the meaning behind that word. Richard's eyes moved from Charles Whitmore to Rebecca and then to the other executives sitting nearby. He was trying to connect the pieces, trying to understand why people he clearly considered important were treating my father with such respect. Unfortunately for him, the answers were not coming easily. "I hope you are enjoying the celebration," Richard continued. "Absolutely," my father replied. "It has certainly been memorable." Charles took a sip of coffee and looked away to hide a smile. He had clearly noticed the same thing I had. My father was being perfectly polite while saying almost nothing. Richard finally decided to be direct. "Forgive my curiosity, but I have been hearing your name quite a bit tonight." "Have you?" my father asked. "More than usual. That happens sometimes." Tyler looked irritated. "You could just tell us what you do." The table became quiet. Several nearby guests stopped pretending not to listen. My father turned toward Tyler. "I have done many things over the years." Tyler rolled his eyes. "That is not really an answer." "It is the truth." Rebecca suddenly spoke. "William has always preferred results over titles." Tyler glanced at her. "That sounds impressive, but it still does not explain anything." Charles leaned back in his chair. "Some people spend their lives trying to explain themselves. Others do not have to." Tyler clearly did not appreciate the response. Neither did Richard. The conversation was slipping further away from their control. Meanwhile, more guests had started gathering nearby. Curiosity had become impossible to ignore. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who exactly was William Carter? Then something unexpected happened. The younger executive's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and immediately sat up straighter. They released the announcement. Charles looked at him. "Already? 5 minutes ago." Rebecca smiled. "That was fast." Richard frowned. "What announcement?" Nobody answered immediately. The younger executive turned his phone toward Charles. Charles reviewed the screen and nodded approvingly. "The market is going to go crazy tomorrow morning." My father sighed. "Probably." The casual way they discussed something that apparently carried enormous significance only deepened the mystery. Richard looked increasingly frustrated. "Would someone please tell me what is happening?" Before anyone could respond, another guest approached the table. This man was younger than the others, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. The moment he reached my father, he extended his hand. "Congratulations, sir." My father shook it. "Thank you." The board voted unanimously. That single sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. Charles smiled. Rebecca smiled. The executives smiled. My father simply nodded as though he had expected the outcome all along. Richard stared in confusion. Tyler looked completely lost. Lauren looked worried. And standing there beside them, I realized something important. Whatever announcement had just been released was connected to my father. Not indirectly, not casually, directly. The respect, the phone calls, the executives, the board meetings, the documents. Suddenly they all felt connected to a much larger story. A story nobody in that ballroom understood yet. But judging by the reactions around the table, the truth was getting closer. Much closer. The room had become completely different from the one I walked into earlier that evening. Hours ago, people barely noticed my father. Now every conversation seemed connected to him in some way. Guests were no longer laughing. They were watching, listening, trying to understand what they had missed. Richard Bennett looked increasingly uncomfortable. The confidence that had fueled his jokes earlier was gone. In its place was uncertainty, the kind that appears when someone realizes they may have misjudged a situation badly. "Bored?" Richard finally asked. "What board?" The younger executive glanced at my father before answering. "The board of Carter Global Holdings." Several people nearby reacted immediately. The name clearly meant something to them. Richard frowned. "I have heard of that company." Charles smiled. "Most people have." Richard looked confused. "What does that have to do with William?" Nobody answered right away. My father remained calm, sipping his iced tea as though this entire conversation had nothing to do with him. That silence only made everyone more curious. Lauren stepped closer. "Andrew, do you know what they are talking about?" I shook my head. And for the first time all night, that answer was completely honest. The younger executive checked his phone again. The financial networks are already covering it. Rebecca laughed softly. That was faster than expected. One of the nearby guests suddenly pulled out his own phone. A few seconds later, his eyes widened. Then another guest did the same thing. Then another. The reaction spread across the ballroom like a ripple moving through water. People were reading something. Something important. Something connected to my father. Tyler noticed it too. What are they looking at? Nobody answered him. A man standing nearby stared at his screen and whispered, "No way." Another guest looked toward my father with open disbelief. Richard immediately pulled out his own phone. His face remained calm for several seconds as he searched. Then everything changed. The color drained from his expression. He looked at the screen, then at my father, then back at the screen again. "That cannot be right," he said quietly. Tyler grabbed the phone from his hand. His confidence disappeared almost instantly. Lauren leaned over to see what they were reading. The room seemed to freeze around them. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "It became official this afternoon." Rebecca nodded. Unanimous approval. The younger executive smiled. Largest private acquisition in company history. Nobody at the Bennett table spoke. They simply stared at my father. The same man they had mocked for his old truck. The same man they had dismissed because of an aging jacket. The same man they assumed had spent his life watching other people succeed. My father set down his glass and looked around the ballroom. His expression never changed. Calm, patient, completely unaffected by the attention. Then Charles said the words that finally shattered every assumption in the room. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. As majority owner, the company is now worth well over $12 billion. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire ballroom stood frozen. Because the truth they had spent all night searching for had finally arrived. And it was far bigger than anyone had imagined. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. The ballroom that had been filled with laughter earlier now felt completely silent. Every person in that room was staring at my father. Some looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. A few seemed unable to process what they had just heard. Tyler was the first to break. He looked down at Richard's phone again, as if reading it a second time might somehow change the answer. It did not. The articles were there. The financial reports were there. The acquisition announcement was there. And so was my father's name. William Carter. Majority owner. Controlling shareholder. A man whose business decisions could move markets and influence companies across the country. The same man they had spent the evening mocking because of an old jacket and an aging pickup truck. Richard looked like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed completely unsure of himself. Lauren stood beside me in stunned silence. I could see her replaying every moment of the evening in her mind. Every joke. Every comment. Every time she chose not to speak. My father remained exactly as he had been all night. Calm. Polite. Unmoved. He did not look angry. He did not look triumphant. He simply looked tired of being the center of attention. Richard finally stepped forward. "William," he said quietly, "I think I owe you an apology." My father smiled gently. "You do not owe me anything, Richard." Richard lowered his eyes. "I judged you without knowing you. That happens more often than people think." Tyler looked genuinely embarrassed now. The confidence that had carried him through the evening was gone. "I was out of line," he admitted. My father nodded. "Perhaps." Then he looked around the room at the guests who had spent hours making assumptions. "The funny thing is that none of this changes who I was this morning. I was the same man when I walked through those doors. The only thing that changed tonight was what people believed about me." Nobody argued because everyone knew he was right. The room became quiet again. My father stood, shook hands with Charles, Rebecca, and the others, then turned toward me. "Ready to go?" he asked. I smiled. "Absolutely." As we walked toward the exit, people moved aside. Some nodded respectfully. Others offered awkward smiles. A few attempted conversations that my father politely declined. Outside, the night air felt cooler and calmer than the ballroom behind us. We walked toward his old pickup truck. The same truck, the same jacket, the same man. Nothing about him had changed. Before getting in, he looked at me and smiled. Never let other people decide your value. I nodded. I will not. He started the engine and drove away into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who had learned a lesson they would never forget. And I learned one too. The richest person in the room is not always the one trying hardest to look rich. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never feel the need to prove anything at all. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow for more stories like this. Your support truly means a lot.